Hello Forrest, how are you? A few videos back, I gave my opinion that in your text, the various anomalies and aberrations may be indications put intentionally in the text by you as to give us a starting point for the discovery of hints that may help us eventually get towards the solution. And I promised to go and provide some examples as to why I think that might be the case. So this is what I would like to do today. So for the big picture, for anomalies, we're interested in what do they mean, how important they are, how do they work. And to see how this could work, I'm not intending here to go through every anomaly that I can think of, just to go through a smaller example of a few anomalies that together point consistently towards one important thing. Okay, so let's start with the T's in the section Tea with Olga. So page 115 to 117 in the text, which I have here in front of me. Okay. So the reason why I think the T's, and many people think the T's are anomalies, is because they stand out from the rest of the story. They seem to be a detail which is somewhat incongruous. 3 points in the story we have you and Olga sitting and drinking tea. At first it is we laughed and drank red tea. Then when you struck the deal with her to buy her little casita for market value, if you were to scatter her ashes after she passes on Taos Mountain, which I guess is Wheeler Peak. And at that time, you say that you sipped black tea and nibbled on Oreos. And then towards the end, you say that Olga was at peace at last after having scattered her ashes, and I suspected she may be having green tea with her father. So we have red, then black, then green, and the black tea with Oreos. Now, these details, they don't fit, and they don't seem, the rest of the story is not quite at a level of detail as to what was going into the conversations and what you were doing. It just seems to be an afterthought at 3 points. So if we think about these colors, red, then black, then green, and we think about the shape of an Oreo with 2 cookie layers and a cream layer in between. So when it sits on your plate, look at it sideways, you have horizontal row black, then horizontal row white, then another horizontal row black. If you put the colors red, black, and green onto that pattern of 3 horizontal stripes, you get a flag, the Pan-African flag, if you look it up. The Pan-African flag is a symbol of African-American pride and resistance. It was created in 1920 as a symbol of freedom. There have been various interpretations of the colors. Red as blood shed for the liberation, black for Black Africa, and green, one interpretation was the vegetation of the motherland in Africa. Another interpretation that I read was the sympathy for the Irish fighting for their freedom, which was happening in the early 20th century as well. So, taken in isolation, you know, if you think of a flag and you take these colors and you put it onto the pattern, the chances are there's going to be some place in the world or some organization that will have that as a flag. So it's not conclusive in itself that this was necessarily intended. However, it's suggestive. But let's move on to another anomaly. This one is in the chapter First Grade, page 16. Now, the T's, a few people, I mean, they have been discussed by people in the past, and even I have put this interpretation myself in comments on people's videos, I think the AGK videos in the past. But it's been mentioned in more than one place. These observations from that I'm going to give you from first grade, as soon as I can find the page, okay, have also been mentioned on AGK channel and other channels. Sometimes John Charles, one of the friends at school, there was one guy, John Charles whatever, who didn't like me or the sign much. He told my friend Billy Joe Ray that he was going to beat up on me just so he could see how high I'd bounce. Sometimes John Charles would bring a little jar of green olives to school and wave that thing in my face. Can you imagine that? So John Charles is an unusual combination of first names, and it makes some people, I must admit not me, I heard about this for the first time from others, it makes people who are familiar with the history of the American West. There's a major figure from that time, from the 1800s, John Charles Fremont, or Fremont, I think he's of French origin, but I guess you call him Fremont. There's so many Fremont streets and here and there, and I have a brother-in-law who lives in Fremont, California. So it's a very famous name. He was involved throughout decades in various aspects of opening up and governing the American West. But one of the things that he is less known for, which is also important here, is that he, and not Abraham Lincoln, was the first emancipator of African Americans in U.S. history. He had been given the command of the Department of the West, based in St. Louis. And in 1861, August 30th, without notifying Lincoln, he issued a proclamation putting Missouri under martial law, and as part of that proclamation, he emancipated the slaves. Within a few weeks, this was overturned by Lincoln so as to avoid tipping the state of Missouri and other states towards secession. As a result of this controversy, John Charles Fremont was dismissed. So it was more than just an act in support of African Americans, as an act in support of the abolition of slavery. It was done as an act of rebellion, or as an impulsive act that had later been overturned by the very person who was given the credit later for the final emancipation of the slaves in the U.S. But we have here two anomalies. One, the T with Olga, the other, the mentioning of John Charles whatever, which is a strange way to hide some of the information from a full name. If you fill it in Fremont, you get two hidden references that can bring you to the struggle for freedom of American slaves and of African Americans. In the same chapter, first grade, right on the next page afterwards, we have a section. My father talked sometimes about another old lunch bucket woman. Her name was Ora May, and I knew her little from the halls. She seemed happy enough with her way of barely getting by, but she was always hiding out and smoking cigarettes with no names on them. Being the school janitor was a big deal, and I suppose that's what she was. Ora May is another name that sort of stands out, not very common. If you Google Ora May, you get Ora May Washington. She was an athlete in the early part of the 20th century, who I imagine would have been familiar to you when growing up. She was a star in basketball and then tennis. She, in tennis, in the African American Tennis Association National Championships, she won the championships 8 times in singles and 12 times in a row in doubles. She was perhaps the greatest tennis player of her generation, but she was never allowed to compete against the white champion Helen Wills Moody because Moody would not agree to the match. So she's an example of a pioneer in African American sports who is never given the proper chance to prove herself and always had to struggle for the freedom to be able to play the best in her sports. So, 3 anomalies, 3 connections to the notions of rebellion, struggle for freedom, and African Americans or slavery. So to continue, we have some anomalies on page 6. It's the chapter without a name. I guess it's could be a continuation of the preface or a pre-introduction. Anyway, on page 6, second paragraph. Then all of a sudden I started getting bald, something I can relate to. Just a little at first, so it wasn't a big deal. I remembered that the same thing happened to President Eisenhower, and he explained it was because his brains were pushing his hair out. Now, this anomaly, as I mentioned in previous videos, was pointed out, first to me anyway, the first I saw it, was when Copper Dan pointed it out on Christie and Mike Calling's show. And he pointed out there that this is an anomaly because if you look it up, you know, the magic of the internet, Google consistently credits that expression to Silvio Berlusconi, the Italian politician. So here attention is drawn to this remark because it is an inaccuracy, which if you look it up, you find out that it's inaccurate. It draws our attention to this. And so the question is, what is special about these people, President Eisenhower, that you would want to put his name there in place of Silvio Berlusconi's? Eisenhower, if you put his name into Google together with freedom, immediately what comes up is the crusade for freedom. Eisenhower, as president in the 1950s, had to contend with the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union and the struggle, the back and forth play over control of Europe. Although resistance to the Soviet pressure, I think, started with Truman, airlift of Berlin. Eisenhower went one step further. He put a crusade for freedom where he put up a freedom bell and freedom scrolls that people would sign, or the bells that would be rung in order to encourage people to think and act and speak out for freedom in Europe. It was part of a larger effort, propaganda effort of sorts, education effort if you prefer. Eisenhower set up a committee called the National Committee for a Free Europe, for which this crusade of freedom was a cornerstone. And in addition to this, Eisenhower was also known for speaking out strongly against racial discrimination and for pushing for desegregation of armed forces. I think something that was accomplished during his presidency. So again, we have another anomaly, clearly intentionally hidden, this time with findable due to an inaccuracy, which, if we follow it up, we find a strong connection to the struggle for freedom. On page 11 and 12 in Important Literature, we have a few more examples. You talk about the book For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. You say on page 11, when I got around to reading that Bell Tolls book, I thought it was just plain. The story is about this guy who was an ambulance driver in World War I, and he was in love with a nurse. There were lots of killing and mud and bombs and dead horses. For Whom the Bell Tolls is actually set in the Spanish Civil War, where Hemingway spent time covering the war as an international reporter. He was a journalist there. It was not it was not about a World War I ambulance driver. That book was Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. So it's an inaccuracy, seems quite intentional, which draws attention to another struggle for freedom, the Spanish Civil War, which is what For Whom the Bell Tolls was really about. You also, further down the page, you say, finally, I just tossed those beauties in the trash basket under my desk and looked away. If Robert Redford had ever written anything, he probably could have done it better than the guy who wrote that Gatsby book, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Robert Redford, as it's been pointed out many times, has written one book that I know of, The Outlaw Trail, A Journey Through Time, which travels along the outlaw trail. So rediscovering the places and the stories of the past of the outlaws, Robber's Roost, and all these other locations where people have basically traveled or hidden themselves in their struggle against authority. So again, rebelliousness, struggle for freedom fits the theme. One more in this chapter, if we go to page 13. A kid I didn't like at all had given me a copy of Kismet to read, and he probably did it on purpose. The story was about this poet in Baghdad who was always picking some guy's pocket, and he was in trouble most of the time, the pickpocket guy I mean. Well, Kismet is a word that has entered the language. It means destiny or fate, and which is quite the opposite of freedom. What is interesting here is, I think it fits this overall theme or pattern of anomalies involving freedom because of the sentiment involved. A kid I didn't like at all had given me a copy of Kismet to read. This is like saying, okay, here we have something which is associated with the opposite of freedom, and that you do not like it, that you identify with its opposite, which is freedom. So when we put all this together, especially with this last mention of Kismet, it seems that more than just drawing our attention to the issue of freedom and the struggle for freedom, in arranging these particular anomalies, you seem to be saying that this is where your own sentiments lie. And that certainly fits with the rest of the book. You have, in the Important Literature chapter, you talk about Catcher in the Rye, which is a classic novel of teenage rebelliousness, finding one's way in society and problems with authority. Right from the very first pages and chapters, it's very clear from the book, right from the very first sentences even. The later chapters where you talk about your feelings towards the biddies, these people a generation or more older than you, who look down upon you, who belittle you, And by expressing your sentiments the way you do in the book, I think you are reinforcing this theme of rebellion against authority, struggle for freedom, assertion of one's independence. This particular chapter, No Place for Biddies, I think some of the strong sentiment, which otherwise looks very much out of place and very shocking, begins to make sense when you think of these anomalies and this as a theme. I think that perhaps your motivation, as a guess, for writing that chapter the way you did was to reinforce this theme, not because you necessarily happen to carry any strong resentment for two particular people who used to live nearby when you were growing up in Temple, Texas. I don't think that is quite the issue. I think the reason why this chapter is here, explained the way it is to reinforce this idea of independence, of struggle for freedom, and rebellion against authority. So in the Totem Cafe caper as well, your feelings towards your bosses, the one driving the yellow Cadillac, and Frosty, also fit this pattern. I think on the surface or openly in your writing style, the style that you use, the themes that are apparent within the book include the rebelliousness, the struggle for freedom, the struggle for independence. But it's interesting that you hide it as well. Before, when I was talking about other styles of puzzle books like Masquerade and the like, where they use anagrams or whether they use codes or encryptions, you can look at the book and you can see that there is something going on there, that there's some sort of puzzle, there's some visual element in a picture that invites further investigation. I think you've taken some of this theme and duplicated it in the anomalies so as to reinforce the fact that this is important, not just to think about, but that it is somehow an important element in the solution of the puzzle and perhaps an important element in the interpretation of some part of the poem. There is one more chapter I'd like to talk about with regard to this, and that is the chapter My War for Me, in the context of what you chose to use as the final symbols in your text. If you go all the way to the back page to the colophon, colophon is like a publisher's sign or mark, in which case you're the publisher, you're the author as well. It's your mark as author, as publisher as well. We have two omegas, the famous double omegas. Some people think that the two omegas stand for FF, Forrest Fenn, somehow. And, you know, reading the text, you could see why they might think that. You talk about time and eternity, and people associate omega with the final letter of the Greek alphabet. And in some religious contexts, you talk about, in Christian or Catholic context, you have I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, that Omega can refer to the end, eternity, the end of life. But I think personally you are fond of double meanings, triple meanings, multiple interpretations. I think this is clear from the poem, that you are using phrases that can be interpreted in many ways, and I think the double omega is no different. If you put in as a Google search, omega and the word freedom, we find that, for those of us who maybe have been a bit too young at the time, we find that the omega was a symbol of the resistance to the Vietnam War. there were at that time people would wear buttons with an omega on it, sometimes multicolored, sometimes rainbow colored, as an indication that they were resisting the draft, that they were resisting the war and they were resisting the draft of the war, that they were asserting their right to freely decide not to go. Putting that together with My War for Me, we look at the statements that you've made. Now, you served with distinction and with pride. You supported the people you served with to great distinction. You did not, I think, when you talk about the people you served with in the military, you can see from the stories how important they are to you and the pride that you took in supporting them. And yet, in My War for Me, when you talk about the war itself, the sentiments you give are different. So, on page 76, for example, at the beginning of My War for Me, you talk about let me read the first few sections. You say that Lyndon Johnson had summed it up under the heading of saving South Vietnam and all of Southeast Asia from communist aggression. You say, I bought into that pretty good. All the pilots did. The endless hours of classroom training and sorties flown in the gunnery ranges around the world had bred us to it. It was almost umbilical. How faint it seems to me now, and how dreadful it still must be for so many others. You say that you may have thought in this way at one time, but that you no longer feel that way. You use expressions like that shiny black war memorial, which is constantly being washed clean by the tears of a million visitors. How unfortunate, skipping a bit, how unfortunate it is that world leaders are constantly bringing war and death to those of us who are doomed to follow their dictates. On page 95, later on in A War for Me, you talk about the French soldiers that fell in the Indochina War. And you say, those who fell there in that hateful, wasteful, losing war, like the one in which I was involved, are forever forgotten, save by me. It has been 56 years since that war, at the time you wrote the book, and no one cries anymore. That thought is deeply personal and indelible in me even now, 42 years after I was there. Page 100. You talk about, instead of all of those medals, I wish I could have been given a college degree in survival, or at least an honorable mention for just having lasted it out. Or maybe when it comes my turn to die, somehow that year could be rebated and tacked on to let me last a little longer. A wasted year. The sense of pride that I felt while serving in that war has since seeped out of me, but I am still alive. What about those whose bones are rotting under the headstones of 1,000 wars? Are we forever destined to the same old bloody waste, forever, over and over? Surely there is more out there. But where? Looking back now, I feel as if I was being slowly educated by a larger hand, one that I could not then identify. Despite your respect for those who served with you and your appreciation for it and your identification of yourself as somebody who has served, I think that the war has left you with feelings of regret, a bit of resentment perhaps, and a feeling that that the whole thing had been a waste, that governments should not do such things, that people should not go after people that in this way, that countries should just let each other alone. I think that this theme of the struggle for freedom is greatly important to you personally and was available to you when you sat down to design your poem and your treasure hunt. I think that by drawing attention to these clues in the way that you have through anomalies, and having many of them tying to the notion of the struggle for freedom, you have, beyond any reasonable doubt, indicated to people who find and assemble these clues that freedom is a key word in this puzzle, and that we should, when looking for solutions to the puzzle, when going through the poem, when going through the book, we should keep this word, this concept, in mind at all times to see what this key word can unlock. So I have more to say about this, more thoughts about how the anomalies might work in general. These anomalies that I pointed out are only the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many, many more. And there's more than one way in which information seems to be encoded. The fact that you are encoding the information, or hiding the information, I shouldn't say encoding, hiding the information in the text in this way, I think is undeniable. So for next time, I'll start going through identifying more anomalies and classifying them somehow to see in what way we might be able to coax more out of the book. But for now, I'd like to just make this particular point about freedom and how important I think it is to the solution of this puzzle. One more thing. When you sign your email messages, when you sign some of the statements that have appeared in your scrapbooks and the like, you used to sign things with 2 lowercase f's, FF. Just like the 2 sigmas in your colophon for your book. Then lately, you've started using a single F. And in Once Upon a While, the colophon, I believe, I haven't looked at the book recently, is only a single omega. I think the omega represents freedom. And I think the F that you write is lowercase because for you, it doesn't just stand for Forrest or Fenn. I think the F stands for freedom.